Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're revisiting the channel Breaking in the Habit with Father Casey in his signature Franciscan monk robe. Since he's getting all dressed up for this one, I thought I'd go a little casual and take off the jacket. I definitely didn't forget my jacket in a car that is now at an appointment with the kids. In this video, he explains 5 reasons that he thinks people are becoming atheists. So we'll see how accurate he is about that, but before we begin, can I just say how ridiculous the modern practice of wearing a habit is? Like, specific to the Franciscans, which is his denomination, the idea is to emulate St. Francis of Assisi, who wore simple robes like that in his humility. It was not only a rejection of fashion, but also a rejection of wealth and status, wearing not only robes that weren't popular, but were made cheaply out of cheap materials. So if they really wanted to emulate St. Francis, the modern equivalent would be something like sweatpants and t-shirts from a thrift store. I looked into how much these habits cost, and the cheapest one I could find was $110, with the next cheapest being over $200. I don't think I have ever spent $110 on a single article of clothing, and if I have, it would have been something like a suit jacket. I forget how much— I wrote in my script that I forget how much this one was, but I'm not wearing it, so the one that's in the van somewhere is the one I forgot how much it is, but it might have been around there. The purpose of wearing a suit, though, is diametrically opposed to the purpose St. Francis had for wearing the habit. It's to be a fancy boy. And in modernity, paying a premium to wear clothes that may not be fashionable to the rest of the world, but are fashionable within a large chunk of the largest religion on the planet, seems to be pretty close to also being diametrically opposed to the purpose that St. Francis had for wearing the habit. Of course, this has nothing to do with the content of his video. I just find it really weird that modern Franciscans are rather ostentatious in their clothing choices, which the guy they're named after would frown upon. So, with that out of the way, let's take a look!
If you've been a Christian longer than a minute, you are probably painfully aware of the fact that faith in much of the Western world is in a downward trend. Over the past decade, study after study has revealed a sharp decline in religious affiliation, church attendance, and belief in God, while the number of people identifying as having no religion has grown rapidly. Why is this the case? Well, it's complicated. Not a mystery, but it's complicated.
I agree. It is complicated. And also not a mystery, though I feel like we're going to have some disagreement about the reasoning.
Some of the problem is definitely with Christians ourselves. If you're interested in an introspective look at what we're doing to drive people away, check out part 2 of this series here.
Noted. I'll go give that a peek and see if it's worth a future response video. Okay, I've watched it. It's the same tripe as every other why Christians are leaving the church video that I've seen. We need more relevant preaching, we need to build community, we need to still be anti-LGBTQ bigots, but we need to be nice to them long enough to get them in the church before we spring the bigotry on them, etc. And if you think I'm exaggerating for effect, I absolutely am not. Not only does he let the mask slip and say that the hatred of LGBTQ people is legitimate,
there is a legitimate fear and hatred in the Catholic Church of our brothers and sisters with same-sex attraction or gender identity issues.
He was also explicit about the whole trick them into the church before showing your bigotry thing.
We welcome them. We're patient with them. We encourage them to change their lives only after we have befriended them and gained their trust.
So that's gross.
Otherwise, what I'd like to look at in this video are the outside forces causing people to become atheist. Here are the 5 biggest threats to faith, and what we can do to respond to each. Number 1. Scientific materialism.
Scientific materialism, which I would think would be the approximate equivalent of methodological naturalism, which, to oversimplify, is that scientists are limited to natural explanations and justifications for their conclusions, irrespective of their own personal beliefs. There are conflicting ideas about how this principle came to be the norm in science, with some iterations of it even going back to people that we wouldn't usually think of when talking about scientific research, like Thomas Aquinas. Sorry, forgot that I'm responding to a Catholic here. That's Saint Thomas Aquinas, who sought to justify his supernatural belief in God using natural reasoning rather than faith or other supernatural justifications. But regardless of how it came to be, the fact of the matter is that methodological naturalism is, as far as we can tell so far, the most effective way for us to learn about how the universe operates. And so, even the most devoutly religious scientists constrain themselves to naturalism when attempting to explain the world. And this even carries over into supernatural conclusions. The efficacy of prayer has been studied repeatedly using naturalistic methodologies. The idea that prayer is effective for anything is a supernatural conclusion, and it has been studied using naturalistic methods. And unfortunately for those who hold to such beliefs, the end results of this research are almost unanimously that prayer is either ineffective or slightly harmful. Of course, the believers in prayer can always wiggle out of these results by saying things like, God doesn't want to be tested, so of course he didn't make the test work. You can't force God to act in order to prove himself. Or some variation of that, lending to the extension of methodological naturalism that is the idea that conclusions should also be exclusive to the naturalistic realm. But that's not a given, and if you can get specific enough with your supernatural claim, it can be tested using naturalistic methodology. So I don't entirely agree with that one, though I am of the opinion that any such tests will come back negative.
Have you ever seen God? Felt a soul? Discovered any evidence for spiritual beings or forces? Chances are the answer is no, which has led many in the modern world to conclude that there is nothing to life but the physical world.
Well, to be fair, if the God described by the Bible exists, then he wants everyone to come to a saving knowledge of him, according to 2 Peter 3:9. So that admission is some pretty good evidence on the side of naturalism.
For materialists, as they're called, we are nothing more than a collection of cells, a series of firing neurons giving the illusion of consciousness, but ultimately just bags of flesh. The material world is all there is.
Why do you say it's only the illusion of consciousness? Even if the material world is all there is, and we are just meat machines with a complicated neuron system, we are still meat machines that have conscious experiences. Being produced naturally does not make it illusory. It just means that there's no ghost in the machine.
As science has progressed over the years, this has become more and more popular.
Ironically, the paper that I pulled from earlier when describing methodological naturalism disagrees. They acknowledge that a common argument in favor of methodological naturalism is the idea that supernatural explanations are always replaced by natural ones as our understanding progresses, but they point out that approaching things from the perspective of natural justifications for observed phenomena is something that has been around since at least the 12th century. I'd argue that it goes back further than that, but this is irrelevant. The fact is that there is a trend in history of natural explanations replacing supernatural ones. Wind was once explained as being caused by a deity of some kind, often being split into four, one for each cardinal direction. It was later found to be caused by the temperature gradient between Earth's equator and the poles, combined with the rotation of the planet and the effects of latent heat of vaporization on water. Lightning used to be caused by a god, Thor, Zeus, Jupiter, the Thunderbird, etc. It was later found to be caused by a sufficiently large electrical potential difference between two areas of space separated by a high-resistance medium. Take any aspect of day-to-day life that relies on something natural and outside of humanity's control, and you'll find that the explanation for those things was tied to pantheons of gods until we figured out the natural explanation.
Emotions can be reduced to chemical imbalances, miracles to natural phenomena.
Chemical imbalance is usually a phrase used to describe mental illness rather than just emotions, albeit that is a bit problematic. But yes, emotions are tied to brain states that have their basis in neurochemistry, which can be altered by altering the chemicals that are present. And given that the mechanisms that affect emotion can be explained naturally, there is no reason to invoke the supernatural in order to explain them.
While there are still some things that science can't explain, proponents of this idea say that it's just a matter of time.
It's not so much that it's just a matter of time, it's more that supernatural explanations have consistently failed as our understanding of science advances, so there's really no justification for advancing a supernatural explanation to begin with. And this has been so consistent that I am actually comfortable with the idea that even if there are some things that science will never be able to explain, that does not then indicate a supernatural explanation.
Since all there is matter, we'll eventually be able to figure it all out.
Strong disagree. I very much doubt that we'll ever get to a point in our scientific understanding of the universe where we can say that we've figured it all out. There's just way too much to figure out for that to be a feasible future for us.
But what about one's conscience? What about a sense of right and wrong?
Empathy, combined with a social contract that developed in a Darwinian fashion as humanity evolved.
If you take this idea to its logical conclusion, there is no free will because everything is already determined by our brain chemistry, which means that no choice is any better than any other because choice itself is an illusion.
Few things here. If a choice is an illusion, that doesn't mean that all choices are equally good, it just means that they aren't really choices. But also, our choices being the result of brain chemistry does not automatically strip us of free will. Given how causality works at the quantum level, which is entirely unintuitive to us, it is entirely possible that all of our conscious experiences could be the result of nothing but brain chemistry, and we could still have free will. It's also possible that this is not the case, that everything does behave purely deterministically, and free will is an illusion. But the fact of the matter is that we do appear to have free will, and there is no benefit to acting as though we don't. And if we don't, then we don't have a choice in the matter anyway, so ultimately the question of free will is rather irrelevant. But it's also an argument from consequences. Even if I grant everything that he just said, what it gets us to is, I don't like that conclusion, so I'm going to pretend that God exists in order to avoid having reached that conclusion.
Hitler wasn't bad, it was just his brain chemistry.
Oh wow, I didn't think you'd go there immediately, but honestly I shouldn't really be surprised. Even if Hitler was behaving purely deterministically and so didn't actually have a choice in the choices that he made, his choices were still bad ones that caused a lot of real harm. And since we, at the very least, have the illusion of free will, then it doesn't make sense to not treat those choices as ones that he, chose.
You're not responsible for anything you do, you're just a collection of complex cells.
I've never understood this line of argumentation regarding the determinism versus free will question. And it always comes from someone arguing against determinism. If people don't actually have free will and their actions are predetermined, then you shouldn't hold them accountable, because they were just acting in the way that the initial state of the universe determined that they would act. Okay, maybe from a perspective where some people have free will and others do not, it would make sense for those who do have free will to be lenient in judging those who do not, since they recognize that they could not possibly have done anything other than what they did, whether they wanted to or not. But if you're arguing against the idea that everything is deterministic and nobody has free will, then to argue that those people who don't have free will ought to behave in a certain way in order to act in accordance with their belief that people don't have free will, then that's just absurd. If the person you're arguing against actually believes that people don't have free will, then there are no oughts. You just behave the way you behave, so keep on trucking in whatever direction you're already headed, and if a change is going to happen, it'll happen. So either, yes, people need to be held to account for their bad actions because they had the free will to do their bad actions, or yes, people will act as though other people should be held to account for their bad actions because they don't have a choice in the matter. The end result is the same. And yes, I do realize that there is more nuance here than what I'm presenting, but I feel like this gets the gist across.
This is absurd.
Indeed it is.
For people of faith, we must stress the individuality of the human person. Our thoughts, hopes, dreams, attractions, choices, everything that points to our uniqueness and our freedom to make decisions.
Okay. Don't see why that would be different from a secular perspective.
When we do this, we show that we are more than just material, that there is something about us that can't be measured or predicted.
No, we don't. We just show that the measurable and potentially predictable things about us are things that we have big feelings about. Feelings that are brought about through measurable, naturalistic processes.
We have a conscience.
We do. However, not everybody's conscience agrees, which leaves us with the whole category of moral philosophy, where philosophers pontificate endlessly about potential sources for our morality, ask questions about whether morality is intrinsic within us, imposed externally, or some combination, all arguing about the nature of our conscience and how reliable our personal consciences are at determining or aligning with morality, whatever morality might ultimately be.
We have a soul. We have something that animates us beyond the physical world, drawing our attention to a reality beyond the physical world.
Citation needed.
Even though we can't prove it, we know that there is something spiritual about our existence.
Why, though? How do we know that? This seems to me like more of an I really, really want this to be true and so choose to believe that it is sort of thing, rather than a this is actually a true thing sort of thing.
Number 2. Rationalism.
Which can be used to reject the idea that belief in something that is not supported by evidence can be justified by appealing to how much you really, really feel like it has to be true.
If materialism is a world defined by science alone, rationalism is a world defined by math and logic alone.
Considering the only thing that apologists can bring to the table when asking for evidence for God are a bunch of logical arguments, you might want to be a bit more careful with this one.
Because the senses, emotions, and conventions can all be flawed, they cannot be trusted.
I mean, yeah, we do know that all those things can be flawed, which is why we need more than just those things in order to justify scientific conclusions.
There is no truth that can surpass pure human reason.
What does that statement even mean? There is no truth that can surpass pure human reason? If stuff existed but humanity did not, then it would be a truth that surpasses human reason that stuff exists. Of course, you could get all philosophical and go into the rationalism versus empiricism thing as a way of grounding your epistemological justifications, but let's be real here. You're talking about 5 reasons that people are becoming atheists. Admittedly, you didn't go the clickbait route and say that these are the top 5 reasons, so props for that, I guess. But still, I don't think the majority of atheists became atheists after doing a deep dive into philosophical rationalism. And if we have to blame a philosophical worldview, empiricism would probably be the more common one.
As with materialism, there is some truth to this. Who's going to argue against science? Who's going to argue against rationality?
Look in the mirror, buddy. You fully endorse the Catholic Church's condemnation of LGBTQ people, despite the fact that it is a well-documented scientific fact that social stigma, such as that which the Catholic Church encourages, is overwhelmingly bad for the victims of the stigma. Being anti-LGBTQ is neither scientific nor rational.
We don't want to be erratic beings guided solely by emotions or intuitions. What do the numbers say? What is logical? These are not bad questions to ask. And yet, we all know that what draws us to a beautiful sunset is not that it is rational.
And why not? Most people probably don't think of it in a purely rational way, but sunsets are pretty. Looking at pretty things triggers the release of endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and other feel-good brain juices. The release of such feel-good brain juices can relieve stress, and are also associated with better physical health, a longer life expectancy, and a reduced risk of diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer. If you want to look at it from a purely rational perspective, stopping to smell the roses makes you healthier, so we evolved signaling mechanisms that encourage us to do so. Well, that specific example wouldn't really work for me. I'm one of those weirdos who thinks that most floral smells are distasteful. But us weirdos aren't likely to successfully change that expression anytime soon, so here we are. So even though we don't necessarily think about it rationally, there is still a reason for our affinity for pretty things that has its basis in rationality and logic, rather than in emotion. Even if the rational explanation is that the evolution of these emotional reactions had a survival advantage.
We fall in love and get married not because we've made calculations and can logically prove through some theorem that love is real. No.
Well, no, that's not why people do that at the individual level, but the feeling of being in love is associated with the activation in the brainstem right ventral tegmental area and right posterodorsal body of the caudate nucleus. I know, I'm a hopeless romantic. And while the feeling of being in love will often lead people to making irrational choices, it is worth noting that the older you are when you get married, the less likely you are to get divorced. Well, specifically for women in the study that I'm looking at, but given that the average age gap in a marriage in the US is less than 3 years, it can be assumed that the number for men is pretty close. Couple that with the fact that the average person's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is largely responsible for our ability to engage in rational decision-making, doesn't fully mature until around age 25, and what we wind up with is a convincing argument that waiting until you are better able to make rational decisions before getting married is a good thing and will lead to longer-lasting relationships. So, yeah, people make irrational decisions when they're in love, especially when they're young.
Life's greatest pleasures, what brings us the most meaning, come not from pure logic, but from beauty and love.
Maybe so, but that doesn't make beauty and love supernaturally based experiences. It just means that sometimes people do stupid things under their influence.
From art, history, music, poetry, literature, and yes, faith.
One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the others by the time I finish this song? Did you figure it out? I think you probably did.
And so, the way that we combat the rationalist is not with reasoned arguments or debate. It's not to play their game with their rules. We must break them out of their isolated worldview to encounter sacred spaces.
It's like you think that having an understanding of how love works neurologically somehow diminishes the actual feeling itself. I still get all gross and mushy about how great my partner is and how lucky I am to have convinced her that I'm worth spending time with, even though I know that it's a result of activation of the brainstem right ventral tegmental blah 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 blah, etc. Knowing that the feelings have natural explanations does not diminish those feelings. Hell, I even know atheists that understand that these things are based in nature and have no supernatural component, but still describe them as spiritual experiences, because socially speaking, that language better conveys how they feel about them to others.
Places that provoke a sense of awe and wonder, that point to something beyond anything that can be explained.
You're showing pictures of churches here, and sometimes not even nice ones. Like, I'll admit that there are some beautiful cathedrals out there. I've been to Notre Dame in Paris. I saw the window, the architecture, the attention to detail, and the decorative carvings. On the same trip, I saw St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which was equally impressive. But I also saw the Palace of Versailles, Edinburgh Castle, Ellien-Donen, Manorbier Castle, Windsor Castle, and probably a bunch more that I'm not remembering offhand. I was a Christian when I went on this trip, a full-blown evolution-denying, tricked myself into thinking I was drunk because I had a sip of a 0.5% ABV lemonade before noticing that it was slightly alcoholic Christian. That's a true thing that happened to sweet summer child Rhino as a teenager touring around the UK and France. But as a devout, firmly believing Christian, the appreciation I had for architecture and art was of the same quality regardless of the religion associated with what I was observing. Okay, well, Manorbier Castle was a bit different because that was a destination based solely on, hey, this old BBC version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that I like was partially filmed there. Sadly, the pictures from that particular castle were on the roll of film that was lost, which, yeah, young people, that was the thing that could happen to you when you went on vacation back in the day, so feel grateful for your all-digital lives? Anyway, I'll never get to show people the pictures of me in that courtyard and proudly tell them that this was the courtyard that they filmed to be the White Witch's courtyard. No, not that version, the one from the 80s. Yeah, that's the one. Great special effects there. My point is that pretty places being pretty is not a function of religion. It's a function of humans liking pretty things, so humans make pretty things. It just so happens that, especially in Europe, the institutions that had access to enough resources to build pretty things that would last for centuries were the religious ones that had access to both money and the ability to exploit their workers under threat of eternal damnation. The buildings actually get a lot less pretty when you take that into account.
As Blaise Pascal once said, "The heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of."
Well, Blaise Pascal also happens to be the guy who is most well known for formulating an argument for God that can be entirely defeated merely by pointing out that religions other than Christianity exist. So forgive me for not taking him terribly seriously.
We know the truth not only by reason, but by the heart.
This is your periodic reminder that a word frequently translated as heart in most Bibles was actually the Hebrew word for bowels, as they saw the bowels as being the seat of tender and loving emotions, and so wrote accordingly. Which leaves us with lovely Bible passages like the Song of Solomon 5:4, which in older translations is, "My beloved put his hand by the hole of the door, and my bowels were moved for him." To paraphrase into modern parlance, he put his hand by the hole of the door and it excited me so much that I shit myself. It's also fun to keep this in mind next time someone tells you that you have a God-shaped hole in your heart. Biblically speaking, it should be bowels, not heart, meaning that you've got a God-shaped butthole. Won't you please let Jesus fill you with his presence and come inside you?
While it's true that our emotions and intuition can't always be trusted, there is no reason to throw it away completely.
Sure, but if there's a discrepancy between my emotions and intuitions and actual verifiable data, I'm going with the data every time. Intuitions can be helpful, but they don't override data. Basically, an intuition is when you feel like something is the case without being able to articulate how you came to that conclusion. It could be that you had a bad feeling about a particular person and intuitively decide that they're untrustworthy. You might not know why you came to that conclusion, but you were likely picking up on things like body language and speech patterns without really thinking about it. And this conclusion could be true, but it could also be false. Maybe the person is entirely trustworthy, but has autism, so comes across as awkward, as well as avoiding eye contact. Signals that could indicate untrustworthiness, but are common symptoms of autism. Intuition in and of itself is not a good method for evaluating the accuracy of a conclusion. It's a neurological shortcut for arriving at conclusions that are accurate enough to help you get by without having to do critical analysis of every little aspect of your life. And your intuitions can actually be trained. Someone with a PhD in mathematics will be able to see math-related things in a more intuitive manner than I can, because they have more experience with math and know how it typically works.
Remember the feeling of seeing your first child. Let yourself be overwhelmed with falling in love. Look at the stars with immense wonder and don't try to analyze why.
You know that it is possible to do all that without trying to analyze why, but all the while still understanding at least some of the basics as to why, right? Like, I don't look at my kids, feel an immense amount of love for those nasty little crotch goblins, and then pick apart why it is I feel that way from an analytical perspective, and try to figure out whether or not those feelings are rational. But I do have a basic understanding of how caring for your own offspring is a trait that comes with an evolutionary advantage. I still love my kids, though.
There's something that speaks to us beyond pure rationality, and it is the truth.
Nah, it's brain chemicals. I guess you could still say that that's the truth. You didn't specify what the truth means here, so I could grant that point. Except we both know that when you say the truth, you mean specifically the iteration of the Christian God that I believe in.
Number 3. Secularism. No doubt you've heard the word secular used by religious people a lot, complaining about a secular world, secular music, secular culture.
Amen, brother. Preach it. Hallelujah.
While often used to denote anything hostile towards religion, what we see in this trend, and what is so dangerous, is something that is solely of this world, pointing to this current age alone.
Okay, it feels like you're about to just jump on the bandwagon that you were speaking somewhat derisively about earlier.
An offshoot of materialism, secularism can see nothing beyond the reality in which we live. This world that we live in, this temporality, is all that exists. There is no heaven or hell, no alternate realms, nothing to hope for beyond this life.
I could quibble with some technicalities in there, I'm sure, but yeah, you've essentially equated secularism with materialism, which it is not. Secularism is, basically, an absence of religious influence in government. Arguably it could extend past governments, but that definition gets to its core. It's not hostile to religion, as is often feared. Rather, it actually treats all religions equally, not giving any one religion preferential treatment over another. In a pluralistic society with people of multiple religions existing alongside each other, secularism is best. Each religion is left to their own devices, and as long as they don't infringe on each other, they can do as they please. Secularism is religious freedom. You can have whatever religion you like, but you can't use the government to force me to behave in accordance with your religion.
It is why the secularist is often so invested in politics and is constantly fighting off despair.
Wow, okay. Sure, we're all fighting off despair. Why not? And secularism is political pretty much by definition, so that almost goes without saying. But honestly, if you were correct about secularists constantly fighting off despair, it's because, particularly in countries like the United States, they are existing in a system that was founded on secular principles, and are watching as those principles get bastardized by those in power in order to impose Christianity on the general population without regard for their own personal beliefs. And they use the language of secularism while doing so. Religious freedom should mean the freedom to hold whatever religious beliefs you like and to act in accordance with those beliefs without having those beliefs or actions imposed on you by someone else's religious beliefs. But Christians have twisted it to mean the ability for Christianity to impose its religious beliefs on everyone, even if they disagree.
If this is the only world, we must do everything to make this world perfect, everything to save ourselves.
Let's pretend for a moment that you're right, and there is an eternal afterlife. Would we not still want this life to be a good one? Sure, it'll be an insignificant blip in the grand scheme of things, but if we can make that insignificant blip a bit more pleasant, why would we not do that? It seems like this worldview would be best for everyone, regardless of who's right.
Unfortunately, this is a problem that has begun to slip even into Christianity.
Yes, there are Christians out there, few and far between though they are, who recognize that imposing their religion on unwilling people is bad for everyone involved. I would rather have a world full of those Christians than those who feel the need to butt into other people's business when they are unwanted.
In certain forms of liberation theology on the left and Christian nationalism on the right.
Did you really just equate Christian nationalism with secularism? Really? The group most responsible for pushing their religious beliefs into the operation of the government are secularists? Well, congratulations! Now I know better than to take you even the slightest bit seriously.
Faithful people lose sight of heaven and invest themselves entirely in fixing this world. Politics becomes their religion, for what else is there?
Politics isn't a religion. Well, at least not for me. There are some who get downright culty about politics, and I'm just gonna go ahead and say it, I think that's weird.
Of course, there is so much more than this world. What we experience in this life is but a foretaste of the life to come.
So once again I ask the question, if that's the case, then why would we not want to make this life as good as possible? Why are you seemingly anti-improvement?
While God's presence is certainly found in this world, and we must do what we can to be good stewards of his gifts, there is something that will inevitably unsettle us about the world, something that should make us feel like it is not our true home. No matter how hard we work, it will never be what we truly desire.
What a weird way to look at the world that we all live in and have to share with each other. But hey, he's kind of saying the quiet part out loud here. One of the arguments against using Christianity as the basis for things like legislation is the idea that they are so focused on what happens after they die that they wouldn't make the best choices for this life. Why help the poor escape poverty when you can tell them about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and save their souls for an eternity of wealth? Why enact environmental protections to make sure the earth is livable for future generations when Jesus might come back and end it all any minute? This is exactly why secularism is important. Some of us would actually like to do everything we can to make this life better for as many people as possible, and don't care for your speculation about what comes afterwards. Worst case scenario here is that we make life better for everyone, Christians included, and then the Christians go and enjoy their eternal paradise when they're done here. But being Catholic, I'd be willing to bet that Father Casey sees value in suffering, seeing it as a way of being brought closer to Christ, which is an attitude that likely contributes to people leaving the church. If your answer to them when they ask for help is to explain that suffering is good for the soul, then they will turn to people who actually do help.
This, right here, is where we must lead people. We must draw out people's dissatisfaction with the world, their deep desire for something more.
I prefer to use that drive to improve the one life that we can all agree that we do get, thank you very much.
Remind them of the futility of their work, that we will eventually die, and that this world will fade away with no memory of us.
Casey, come on, you're saying the quiet part out loud again. Yes, this is another problem that I have often discussed regarding Christianity. The idea that this life doesn't matter, so focus on the next one. And I've often gotten comments from people criticizing me for suggesting that that's how Christians think, because they usually avoid flat out just saying it like that. But yeah, the fact that this life will end does not make it less valuable. In fact, in light of atheism, this life becomes infinitely more precious than in the Christian worldview, precisely because it is finite and will end. Scarcity increases value. If this is the only life we have, we'd better make it a good one. And since there are people in this life that I care about who will hopefully still be around after I die, better do my best to make sure they will have as good a life as possible as well after I'm gone. And while we're at it, why not help out those who are less fortunate than I am, doing what I can to make their lives good as well, since this is the only one that they get too. But in the Christian view, who cares? An eternity of paradise is coming, so this life can go fuck itself.
Deep down, we know that this is wrong. Deep down, there is a longing in each one of us for eternity.
Not for me. I think eternity would grow tiresome. Certainly I do think it'd be nice if I could live a few thousand years at the least, presuming good health for those few thousand years, but eventually, in an eternal paradise, you've done everything that you wanted to do, had all the experiences that you wanted to have, seen everything that you wanted to see, and will get tired of it. Maybe it'll be a few thousand years, maybe a few million, but eventually you'll just be done. And I know that I'm not the only person who feels this way. The series finale of The Good Place, after all, was, spoiler alert, them fixing heaven by allowing people to choose oblivion once they're ready. That was quite a popular show, and while I haven't done an exhaustive search of all reviews of it, I have never heard their fix for heaven at the end was unrealistic. Everyone would just want to live forever as a complaint. Maybe there are some people who would never choose oblivion, but there are definitely many who would.
Number 4, relativism. You do you. Whatever makes you happy. Well, that's just my truth.
With the caveat that whatever you do when you do you do not harm others, sure. And the "that's my truth" thing is usually misinterpreted by apologists to be referring to matters of fact rather than matters of opinion. But when I say, I really despise mint, that is, in fact, my truth. Many people don't understand how I can dislike mint, and they will talk about how fresh and wonderful they find it to be. Okay, that's nice, that's their truth, sure, but mine is that mint is gross.
Mantras of a generation. Mantras of a world defined by relativism. Truth that is purely subjective.
Truth can be subjective, like in the aforementioned matters of opinion, but not all truth is subjective.
The opposite of rationalism, relativism posits that all truth is defined not by facts or logic, but by the feelings and experiences of each individual.
I would think that the opposite of rationalism would be irrationalism rather than relativism, but I guess that's just Father Casey's truth.
Something may be true for one person, but not for another. For years, Pope Benedict XVI warned against the dangers of relativism, but even he could not have predicted how quickly it would pull at the very fabric of our society.
People have had opinions for all of human history, my dude. And given that the guy who is said to be the first overt champion of relativism is Protagoras of Abdera, who lived in the 5th century BCE, I'd say it was a rather slow pull.
In so much of our world today, facts have no worth.
And while saying that, you're showing a headline from an article that is 100% about how facts are valuable and is speaking out against the spread of misinformation, with a specific focus on Trump's use of misinformation during his 2016 campaign. It is essentially telling the story of how a culture of misinformation developed, and talks about it as a problem to be solved. It's almost like you saw a headline that fit with what you were trying to say, and you decided to ignore the contents of the article in order to use that headline to support your truth without regard for the actual facts.
Logic is irrelevant.
And again, you're showing an article whose headline seems to be supportive of what you're saying, but when you read the actual article, it's talking about how to get around people's confirmation bias so that actual facts that run counter to their position will be fully considered. It is, once again, an article explaining the importance of facts and how to get those facts to be seen as important. If relativism was such a pervasive problem, you'd think you could find at least one headline that's attached to an article that actually does promote the version of relativism that you're described, but you can't. So I guess it's just your truth.
There appears to be nothing that we can agree on and no way to come to consensus.
Okay, maybe you're just being lazy with your headline grabbing, because it should be easy to find articles talking about the growing divisiveness in politics in recent years. But the "When Did Liberals Become So Unreasonable" article is an interview with a guy during Obama's administration where he's essentially complaining that Democrats don't treat their leaders as infallible figureheads to be universally admired like Republicans do, instead holding them to high standards to deliver the goods. I'd actually be interested in seeing whether or not he has the same opinion today after seeing how Trump basically formed a cult of personality around himself as a political strategy, and seeing how harmful that has been to American politics as a whole. The "Why It's Almost Impossible to Argue with the Right" article does a bit of a better job of actually representing what he's talking about, as it's someone laying out their case that the right-wing media actively works to spread misinformation in such a way that if their officials actually address what they are saying, it provides them with additional material that they can use to amplify that same misinformation. But if they ignore it, then it spreads without challenge. Using the example of Biden's proposal of having people go door to door to provide people in communities that have low vaccine rates with information on the vaccines, which resulted in right-wing politicians like Madison Cawthorn going on to outlets like Fox News to talk about how this policy would lead to Biden sending his cronies door to door in order to take away all your guns and Bibles. And the author concludes by saying that countering the bad information with good is not the way to break through to people who don't even listen, but exposing their methods through things like satire might have a better chance. So at least that article talks about how hard it is to find agreement across political aisles, and so is somewhat relevant to what he's saying?
But surely no one can actually believe in relativism. There is a world with definitive forces and laws, with measurable experiences and matter, things that are one thing and not another.
So, fun fact here, I was about to chastise him again for talking about relativism as if all relativists hold to the idea that all truth is relative, but then thought I'd better double check the entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy because there might very well be a category of philosophers who do hold to that idea. And when I went down to the "What is Relativism" section, the first paragraph says, "The label relativism has been attached to a wide range of ideas and positions which may explain the lack of consensus on how the term should be defined. The profusion of the usage of the term relativism in contemporary philosophy means that there is no ready consensus on any one definition." So, amusingly, the very definition of relativism is relative. That said, he seems to be talking about global relativism, the belief that all is relative, which is not a position that most philosophers would agree with. It's actually pretty obviously self-defeating. If relativism is global, then relativism itself is relative. So someone that holds to local relativism is correct under global relativism, which would make global relativism incorrect for everyone. So clearly there are things that are not relative. The categories that contain these things can be debated, but they generally are either matters of opinion or abstract concepts, like aesthetics or morality.
Ignorance may lead us to different conclusions, but there are right and wrong answers, things that are the way they are regardless of perspective.
That doesn't apply to everything, though. Some things are matters of opinion and perspective. Such things are relative. What things fall into the category of relativism can be debated, but the fact that some things are relative cannot.
And if this is true, if there is only one thing that is objective, how did it come to be that way?
That seems like a rather unnecessary question. If a rock exists, then it is an objective fact about reality that that rock exists, because that's how those words work. There's no deep philosophical truth to be uncovered here, it's just that a statement that accurately describes physical reality is an objectively true statement. Now, our perceptions of physical reality are imperfect, so sometimes there can be a question of whether a statement about physical reality is actually accurate, or if it just appears to be accurate, but might be shown to be inaccurate given more data. But that doesn't change the fact that if a statement is actually accurate, then it is an objective fact. I mean, you could go back to the cosmological argument and ask why stuff exists in the first place, but you're taking a rather roundabout way of getting there if that's what you want to do.
Why is there something rather than nothing, and why is it intelligible at all?
Okay, yeah, you're just taking the roundabout way to the cosmological argument, with a sprinkling of the teleological argument at the end. Well, I go into more detail about that in other videos, so I'm not going to start on that here. Last week's video is actually a decent starting point if you're interested. But at the end of the day, stuff exists is an objective fact. Asking why that stuff exists, or why it is intelligible, is to ask questions which are unanswerable at this time. Well, intelligible is a fairly easy explanation in my opinion. We evolved in this world, and a mostly accurate understanding of the world would yield a better survival advantage than an inaccurate one. So we evolved to understand the world that we live in. Fun fact, this actually plays into why the question of why stuff exists, or more properly put, how did stuff come to exist, is so hard for us to wrap our heads around. We evolved to survive on the African plains, so our brains are optimized for understanding that environment. That's why we discovered Newtonian gravity before we developed the theory of relativity. Newtonian physics operates at scales that we evolved to understand. Relativity operates at scales that are completely foreign to us. The early universe was dominated by quantum forces, which are so unintuitive to us that quantum physicists will tell you that if you think you understand quantum physics, then you don't. Or, at least, that's a paraphrase of a quote that's often attributed to Richard Feynman, though nobody seems to know exactly when he said it, though there is general agreement that it's the sort of thing he was likely to say, and there is a video of him saying that nobody understands quantum mechanics.
On the other hand, I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics.
So, I'm comfortable with that attribution.
The person of faith, quite obviously, will point to God, objective being itself. There is something that created all that is and knows all that is.
And there is very little in the way of justification for such a belief, outside of arguments from ignorance like the cosmological argument, or arguments from consequences like the moral argument.
We may have our own individual perspectives and experiences of the created reality, but there is but one objective created reality because there is but one objective creator being.
That's a transfer of properties that I don't think is justified. Like, would a pantheon of objective creator gods necessarily create several objective realities? Could they not together create one objective reality? If I were to build one Lego set with one of my kids, there are two of us. Did we, because we are two, build two Lego sets despite setting out to build one?
And finally, number 5, nihilism. If there is one thing spreading through Gen Z like wildfire, it's this.
Seeing Christians with attitudes of let the world burn, we're going to paradise later, being in charge of the most powerful country in the world, probably has something to do with that.
Hopelessness, apathy, distrust. We're worse off than the generation before us, and it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, I'm done checking all his headlines. At this point, I'm comfortable assuming that he's just pulling headlines without reading the articles to see if they actually say what the headlines imply. Always keep in mind when reading the headline that headlines are not usually written by the author of the article. They are written specifically to generate as many clicks as possible, and so to be as sensational as possible. As a result, they often don't accurately reflect the contents of the article. But yeah, that is a general feeling that kids have nowadays. Wages are stagnant as prices rise. Climate change is already costing billions of dollars per year, and that cost is estimated to rise to the level of trillions of dollars per year by 2050, with most politicians in positions where they could mitigate those costs being so old that they're not likely to live to 2050 to see the consequences of their policies for themselves. There's good reason for them to feel disenfranchised and hopeless when they are ignored in favor of oil companies with deep pockets who are willing to donate to politicians who don't actively push for legislation that would harm them. And given that a lot of these lawmakers justify their short-sightedness by appealing to God being in control, it is undeniable that religion in general, and Christianity in particular, has played a large role in this general state of apathy.
There's nothing we can do.
Well, there are things we can do, but given that you were complaining about people wanting to make the world a better place earlier, I doubt you really care all that much.
The nihilist gives in to the idea that there is no point to anything and that resistance is futile.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that literally the position you were advocating for in the secularism section? The whole attitude of we shouldn't focus on making this world better because we've got an eternity of paradise that is our true home seems pretty nihilistic if you ask me. But also, you're talking about nihilism as though it's a universally hopeless worldview that sees no reason to do anything. But what I was describing earlier about how if this is the only life we get, we should do what we can to make it as good as possible, is a view of optimistic nihilism. I don't need my life to have some deeper purpose that resonates throughout eternity in order for my life to have meaning. I get to choose my own meaning, specifically because there is no external force imposing meaning on me. My relationships with the people that I love can be the primary focus of my life without worrying about pleasing a god whose purposes run counter to my own. And when all is said and done, it won't matter that I ran face first into a street sign while an entire busload of kids from my school watched and laughed at me, because all will fade out of existence. So ultimately, our lives are really just about our lives. Nothing more, nothing less. So you do with your life what you want to do with it, while being respectful of other people who are doing with their lives what they want to do with it. So if you want to wear expensive brown robes to broadcast to the world that you're more pious than they are, fine. Go for it. That doesn't actually hurt anyone, and it gives you a feeling of satisfaction. But don't advocate for harmful things like the rejection of LGBTQ rights, because that has a negative impact on people who aren't you, and who aren't doing anything that would harm you.
Why try?
Because this is the one and only life that I get, and I want it to be a good one.
And in one sense, you can probably see why. They grew up after 9/11. They've seen 2 economic crashes and a global pandemic. Their formative years have been during the most divisive time in American history.
I'd argue that the actual Civil War was more divisive than modern America, but yeah, those are mostly true statements.
They were basically raised on Vine and TikTok and have been using it as a coping mechanism to deal with the bleakness of our world. But cope, they have not.
This has big old man yells at cloud energy.
Because we all know that social media can be as much an echo chamber as anything else, perpetuating what we want to hear and shielding us from alternative narratives.
Echo chambers are a weird phenomenon. Some studies find that they are a thing that exists, others find that they don't really exist, and others still find that they sometimes exist, but are a lot more rare than is commonly believed. Personally, I think that a bigger problem than echo chambers is algorithmic content recommendation. The algorithm figures out what kind of stuff you click on, looks for more of that stuff to show you, while highly favoring content that generates more interaction in the form of likes, shares, and comments. Don't forget to like, share, and comment on this video. This means that, if you let the algorithm take control, you will be pushed into more inflammatory spaces with more radical content. This doesn't mean that you'll never be exposed to ideas that run counter to that content on social media, but if you've actually been sucked into the rabbit hole, you will put less weight on those ideas than the ones you already agree with. That was the whole point of that news article you showed earlier about how facts don't change people's minds, actually.
Like the fact that we are technically in the most peaceful time in human history. Children have never been safer from disease. Poverty is at an all-time low, literacy an all-time high. In so many ways, the world is filled with goodness and progress.
Tell that to the Christians talking about how these are like the times of Noah, where everyone is wicked and evil, and use the Bible to support that. Of course, the most peaceful time needs to be caveated, as the wars in Gaza, Ukraine, and Ethiopia are most definitely impacting that number. The Gaza war is too recent to have firm figures on, but 2022 had the number of combat-related deaths at a 28-year high thanks to the Ukraine war and the Tigray war.
As Christians, it can be easy to look at this world with frustration, but we can never give in to despair.
Notably, nihilism is not synonymous with despair. Nihilism is simply the belief that nothing ultimately matters. You can agree that our lives matter, and still hold to the view that in 5 billion years when the sun expands and engulfs the Earth, everything that humans did on that Earth will cease to have meaning in the universe. But I won't be here in 5 billion years to care about that. I am here now.
This place may not be heaven, but Jesus himself says that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Everywhere we look, the presence of God is readily available for those who wish to see.
Except you opened this video by essentially admitting that most people will never experience the presence of God.
Have you ever seen God? Felt a soul? Discovered any evidence for spiritual beings or forces? Chances are the answer is no.
Also, many atheists, myself included, became atheists after diligently seeking God's presence and finding it to be absent. If it is there for those who want to find it, why did so many of us who wanted desperately to find it not find it?
Our lives may not make the difference we want them to make, but they do make a difference, and there is a purpose to our lives even in the absurd parts. If we want to break people out of this nihilistic thinking, we must point them to the cross, the sign that God loves us so much that he would enter this world to die for us, to save us from darkness, to save us from sin, to save us from meaninglessness. It is from this heroic act of self-sacrifice that death itself is conquered, and we are shown that even the most despairing of lives can be redeemed.
That doesn't actually give our lives meaning or purpose, though. Accepting a human sacrifice in order to find meaning just seems gross. But also, this whole God humbled himself to do this thing for you shtick misses a crucial point of the claimed nature of God. He is supposed to be omnipotent, which means that not only was the human sacrifice thing completely unnecessary, as an omnipotent being is capable of forgiving people without there being a sacrifice first, but even if that is his chosen method, it took him literally no effort, and since he's an eternal being as well, it doesn't even rise to the level of a minor inconvenience for him.
Super easy, barely an inconvenience.
So for me to be super duper grateful that God did a thing that cost him literally nothing if he actually has the nature Christians say he has, just doesn't follow.
There's a reason for everything and hope for the future.
Is there a hope for the future for those that God condemns to eternal torture in hell? That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Shock of God, who says, "You sound as gay and lame as your arguments, lol." Honestly, I'm just happy to find out that Shock of God is still around. I did my one response video to him back in 2017 and then basically forgot that he exists. I don't recommend that video of mine, it wasn't great, but neither was his. Anyway, yeah, you can call me gay if you like. Only people who don't feel comfortable or confident in their own sexuality would think that that was an insult. And as to lame, I'll just point out that he left this comment on one of my videos responding to Matt Powell, who is quite possibly the most idiotic creationist I have ever responded to. So if you're coming out on the side of Powell, then that says a lot about you. Okay, now scurry back to the void to where I can forget that you even exist. See you in another 7 years or so. Hell, keep showing up on my radar in 7-year increments, and I might think you're a Vulcan after some Pon Farr action with me. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the presence of God that will never be experienced by the people who are my channel. If you'd like to be proof that God exists that nobody will ever get, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.viceround.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! That developed in a Darwinian fashion as humanity evolved. Humanity. Got developed in a Darwinian that time, but humanity evolved. The evolution of these emotional feelings. That's what emotions are, you idiot.